Now let's look at the influence of stress. And to understand stress, we have to understand this set of structures that make up the HPA. The HPA stands for the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the adrenal cortex, also known as the adrenal glands. And so this is a connection between the brain and the hormonal system here through the adrenal glands, because the adrenal glands are going to release cortisol, commonly known as the stress hormone. So let's take a look at how this system works. The hypothalamus, of course, receives information from other parts of the brain, including the amygdala. Remember, that is part of the fear pathway. So the amygdala, if it detects some kind of threat, is going to signal the hypothalamus and engage the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to turn on the sympathetic nervous system. It is also going to go out and influence our hormone levels, and it's going to do this by releasing a releasing hormone, in this case CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Remember, a releasing hormone is just a hormone that goes right here to the neighboring anterior pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland, when it receives that releasing hormone, produces a hormone that does travel through the blood supply, in this case ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. ACTH goes then through the body until it reaches the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands then make cortisol. And it is the cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and which then goes and affects various systems in our body and our brain, because there are receptors for cortisol throughout the body and brain. In addition, the adrenal glands and the cortisol are going to affect our immune system. So we see that. And we also see that this system is able to provide negative feedback, because the hypothalamus, as it does with other hormones, is going to measure the levels of the cortisol and adjust it accordingly. So this system, this HPA system, is the connection between our brain's responses to threat and stress and our hormonal reactions. And so this is where we get our hormonal, our stress hormones, and also the ability to influence the immune system as a result of stress. And so when we think about the research on depression, we know that there is a long history indicating that stress is a risk factor for depression. And then we can ask the question, well, how, and why? How is it that stress influences depression? How can stress lead to depression, and how can it change the brain? Because we know that there are brain changes that correspond with depression. So how does that happen? And so it turns out that cortisol is going to be one of these important links between stress and depression. Stress leads to an increase in cortisol levels, and then we know that parts of the brain, including the hippocampus, have lots of receptors for cortisol, and unfortunately the hippocampus reacts very badly to large amounts of cortisol. It actually will lose neurons and it will get smaller, and a smaller hippocampus seems associated with depression. There's lots of research indicating that there can be up to about a 20% reduction in the size of the hippocampus in people who are depressed. So let's take a look at how chronic stress affects the hippocampus. And so we're looking at cortisol-related damage to the hippocampus. And we can see here, for example, in slices of monkey brain, we can see that the dark dots here are all neurons in the hippocampus. And in an animal that has been subjected to high amounts of stress, we can see that there are fewer of the neurons in the hippocampus. And so that's an example of the types of things that we see. The hippocampus is kind of an interesting structure. It's involved in learning and memory, but it's also a structure that continues to produce new neurons in it. And so stress through cortisol ends up reducing the number of new neurons in the hippocampus. And that is associated with depression in humans. There is an interesting example in your book. People in the vicinity of the 9/11 attacks in New York City, so if they were closer to the Twin Towers, they suffered from higher levels of cortisol, and they had damage to the hippocampus and other areas, including the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex. Individuals 200 miles away did not. So, and there's lots of research. Your textbook actually does a really good example of how stress can lead to damage in the brain. Stress resulting from things like childhood maltreatment, environmental disasters, and so on. So we see lots of examples in your book. So please take a look at that. Also, it's important to note that damage to the brain can be caused by elevated levels of cortisol, but also sometimes we see that actual levels of cortisol are lower, but there's an enhanced sensitivity. There has been receptor upregulation. And unfortunately, that means that even though there's less cortisol, the brain is more sensitive to it, and so it's more likely to get damage from it. Now, brief stress actually increases immune system activity, so that's not a problem. We get into trouble when we encounter long-lasting stress. So chronic stress also impairs our immune system, and so here's an example of a study where they infected individuals with the cold virus, and depending on how much stress they indicated they had, they were more likely to develop the cold. So those with the highest levels of stress were approaching 50% likely to develop the cold. And in contrast, those who had lower levels of stress were only about 27 or 28% likely to develop the cold. So the incidence of developing the cold almost doubled if they had higher levels of stress. In addition, our hearts are also susceptible to stress. So here we can see that there was an earthquake in January of 1994, and on that day, the number of deaths due to cardiac arrest increased dramatically. So how about physical pain versus emotional pain and how it affects our brain? The somatosensory cortex is the part of the brain that corresponds to our sense of touch in our bodies, and activity there reflects pain perception, but only physical pain perception. It's the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, that seems to deal with our emotional reaction to pain, including the pain of others. And so here we can see the somatosensory cortex in individuals who are touching something hot, and in the middle, the cingulate cortex. So the emotional reaction seems to be attributed to activity in the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, but the physical sensation of the heat is tracked to the somatosensory cortex. And now we'll turn our attention to aggression. So there are going to be multiple factors involved in aggression. We're going to see this as a classic gene and environment interaction. Genetics. There are genes that influence dopamine, GABA, and serotonin system, and these genes are associated with different types of behaviors, including aggression. So let's take a look at one particular gene. This is the MAOA. So the MAOA comes from the monoamine oxidase. And remember, the monoamines are the neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So when we look at MAOA, we're looking at the levels of serotonin and dopamine in particular. And so there are here two different lines representing individuals with either low serotonin activity or individuals with greater serotonin activity based on this genetic profile. And I just want to point out that when there was no childhood maltreatment, there was no greater incidence of violent offense in individuals with the gene that corresponded to lower levels of serotonin. But let's see what happens in individuals who do experience childhood maltreatment. And as we can see here, once there is probable or severe childhood maltreatment, we can see that the percentage of those who are convicted for violent offenses goes up to about 30%. And that's higher than what we see in those who don't have the genetic predisposition for low serotonin based on this gene. So childhood maltreatment does increase the likelihood of violent offenses, and that increase is greater in those with this genetic profile. But look what happens again. Is there any effect of the gene when there's a lack of childhood maltreatment? No. So this is, again, a gene and environment interaction. We need both. We need the gene to be there as well as the environment to provide the combination of factors that lead to an increased risk of violent offense. And so there has been a lot of discussion on the strength of the influence of genetics on behavior, and there's even interest in looking at something called the warrior gene. But it's important to keep in mind that, number one, these effects of genes tend to be pretty small. So when we look at the effects of these genes, we can see study after study comes up and says, oh, you know, a particular gene might influence, say, 4% of the variation in these individuals. So there's really not a case with any of the genes having to do with something like aggression. There's really no evidence that a single gene is able to really dramatically increase the likelihood of a particular trait like aggression all by itself. And in fact, what we do see is that there's often an environmental interaction so that the gene interacts with the environment. But even then, often there are other factors and other genes that are also important. Catchy name, warrior gene, but there's really no evidence that anyone that inherits this gene suddenly becomes more prone to violence or to war or anything like that.